when I was 21, a gun was put to my head and I was told that I was going to die. And then the trigger was pulled. And it's the most difficult thing that ever happened in my life. Almost nothing else since that moment seems to matter very much to me. Like all the problems of my life now seem minuscule compared to a moment when someone puts a gun to your head and begins counting back from 3.
Matthew Dix is a record 60-time Moth StorySLAM champion and 9-time GrandSLAM champion whose stories have been featured on the nationally syndicated Moth Radio Hour and the weekly Moth podcast. He's the award-winning best-selling author of the book Storyworthy: Engage, Teach, Persuade, and Change Your Life Through Storytelling. He's a TEDx speaker, and his stories have appeared on PBS's Stories from the Stage, with his work also being featured in Newsweek and on so many other platforms. Matthew's taught at multiple universities, including Yale, MIT, and Harvard, and with the publication of his newest book, Stories Sell, he's become a marketing consultant to some of the world's biggest companies, including Amazon, Slack, and Salesforce. So, needless to say, this was a pretty big deal to get Matthew to sit down for an hour and share his most valuable storytelling strategies with my listening audience. We cover so much ground in this vast hour. We talk about how to begin a story, what to leave in and what to leave out, how to integrate your story into your message so that your audience will continue listening even after the story is over to the rest of your presentation. Of course, we talk about why vulnerability is so powerful in storytelling.
There is something about vulnerability that people are drawn to because vulnerability requires courage, and people are drawn to courage. And so to watch someone stand on a stage and say, here is how I'm flawed, is not an easy thing for a person to do. And that's why we tend to admire it.
And the thin line between being vulnerable and oversharing.
There's a saying in storytelling, we say we tell our stories from our scars, not our wounds. So if you are sharing a story as a means of therapy, or you have not processed a moment sufficiently enough, then it is a terrible moment for an audience.
And most importantly, how to hold an audience's attention from start to finish.
We want to create a situation where the audience is guessing or unable to guess but wants to know the answer to the next thing we're going to say.
We discuss the things you should never talk about when speaking publicly.
I think the line is pretty far away most of the time. I was at a Moth StorySLAM a few years ago in New York. A woman took the stage and she began telling the story about her abusive husband. And she had the man murdered to protect her child. The room went silent when she said it.
And that's just the beginning. How to remember your stories, how Matthew manages short attention spans, how AI is going to affect storytelling, and how to leverage an audience's own imagination for efficient storytelling. There is so much valuable and timeless information packed into this 1-hour episode. You're going to want to bookmark it, take notes, and keep on coming back to it again and again before every presentation that you give. I learned so much from my interview with Matthew Dix, and I'm sure you will too. So now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Matthew Dix. I'm going to jump in the middle, which is, I think, that's your philosophy, right? Start in the middle,
Yep.
just jump right in.
Yeah.
So for me, the two pivotal things that I learned from you that really shifted my mindset about how to approach stories. The first one is other people's stories, not telling other people's stories, telling your own stories. And if you have to tell other people's stories, find a way to make them your own in order to tell them over. And I wondered if you could unpack that a little bit and maybe how you came about to that methodology, that philosophy, and how you approach it.
Sure. I guess one of the critical elements in storytelling is the idea of vulnerability and the willingness to reveal a small or a large part of yourself. When we tell other people's stories, essentially, we're telling stories of fictional people. They're not in the room, and although they theoretically live or had lived at one point, they really don't sort of exist in a real sense to the audience. And they amount to history, and history oftentimes is not terribly appealing to a lot of people. I actually am a huge history buff, But for most people, listening to stories of dead people or people who are not present is just not interesting. If I was to tell you, my buddy told me a story about his friend yesterday, and it's an amazing story. Would you like to hear it? Like, that's so far apart from you that even if it's an amazing story, it means nothing to you. Whereas if I said, hey, something kind of interesting happened to me 5 minutes ago, do you want to hear about it? You're more likely to want to hear it because you're in my presence while I tell it. So that aspect of being present with the person who experienced the event and the vulnerability required to share something of yourself, those are critical to storytelling. So even when you're going to tell a story about someone else, you either ideally capture that event through a lens of your own. You talk about how that person's experience has changed you in some meaningful way. Or if you have to, there are other tricks like using the second person, which is also very useful in terms of at least maintaining a narrative structure and keeping the audience fixated on what you want them to be looking at, as opposed to affording them choices. As soon as you give an audience a choice, they're going to choose the wrong thing, and now you've lost control of your story.
Can you give me an example of using the second person? That's very intriguing to me.
Sure. So, if I was to tell the story of, let's see, I'll think of one of my students today, for example. At recess time, something happened, right? So it didn't happen to me. It happened to one of my students. My students told me about the moment that happened later on, right? So it might go something like, I want you to see a grassy hill. It's not very steep. It's not very big, but it is a hill. And there's a 10-year-old on the hill. It's a boy. It's a short little boy. He's typically well behaved. He's smiling. He's having a good time. It's recess and it's sunny. And now I want you to see an overhanging branch coming out of the forest, leaning over towards that hill that he's on. And now look at those boys' eyes. They twinkle. They see the branch. They see the overhanging branch. The boy's eyes look at the branch, and inside the boy's head, one thing appears. I got to get that branch. And so now I want you to see his feet moving towards the forest, a place he's not supposed to go. I want you to watch him look back and forth, left and right, seeing if a teacher is watching. And when he sees that there is no teacher watching, I want you to see him dart out and reach and grab that branch. And now I want you to see the place on the tree where the branch connects to the trunk. And I want you to hear the first crack as he reaches for that branch. And now I want you to see that branch break off. And I want you to see the boy's eyes open wide as he realizes he's bitten off more than he can chew. I want you to see the branch come down on the boy. I want you to see the boy hit the hill. I want you to see the branch and the boy hit the hill together. And I want you to hear the boy go, oof. He's learned his lesson. Stay away from the woods. Leave those branches alone. So the idea in that is that I'm going to tell you what I want you to look at each time by saying, I want you to see, I want you to hear. If I tell you that story from the drone's eye view, sort of above, I would just say a boy named Charlie standing on a hill decides he's going to go to the bottom of the hill and grab a branch that's hanging out from the edge of the tree. And I haven't given you anything to look at. You don't really know what to focus on. But if I control the story, I can say, I want you to see his eyes go wide. I want you to see his feet moving. I want you to see the place where the branch connects to the trunk. I want you to hear the crack. Like, it just allows me to dictate the narrative in a way that if we simply tell it in the third person, we have no control over the story anymore.
Yeah, it reminds me of guided imagery almost.
Yeah, it's actually it's a trick that I learned listening to a podcast called The Memory Palace. And in that podcast, Nate DeMeo, the host, he uses it occasionally to sort of get control of the narrative when it's too sprawling to sort of capture in that third person. And so I heard him do it once and thought, oh, I can do that. And I've been practicing ever since. And when I officiate a ceremony for a marriage, which I do quite a bit, they always want me to tell stories about them, which means I'm telling stories about someone other than myself. I'm always using the second person so that I can hone in on whatever aspects of the narrative I want them to see.
Wow. Wow. What a great trick. That's amazing. I'm so fascinated that you're still a teacher, that you've remained, even despite your acclaim, you've remained a teacher, and you must be one of the most popular teachers in the school, if I had to guess.
I am either very popular or very unpopular, depending on who you're speaking to.
Yeah. Um, one of the questions that I have is, I guess, as a school teacher, you probably be able to appreciate this the most, which is finding the balance between telling a story. I'm sure the kids love when you tell stories, but you also have information to impart. And there's always this tension where you're either entertaining or inspiring, or people are enjoying the storytelling, and then there's the part where you have to veer into, you have to transition into the substance, and then sometimes people tend to they'll nod out, and then they'll come back in for the interesting part. How do you make it synchronous so that it doesn't seem so fragmented? Like, I'll entertain you, then we'll do some work, and then I'll entertain you again. And I know I often struggle with that as a pulpit speaker sometimes, when I have some substance to impart, but the story is maybe used as a hook, or as an attention grabber, and then you go into the substance. How do you navigate that?
So I don't use the story as a hook. The story is integral to the lesson that I'm teaching. Whether I'm delivering a TED talk or I'm a substitute minister at churches and I essentially tell stories and then glean some wisdom from the story, the two have to be connected completely. So I am choosing a story that matches the content that I am going to be teaching. And that it goes for if I'm teaching long division to my students, I will start with a story. And that story in long division is something probably about the idea that there are some processes in life where you can make lots of mistakes and you still get a decent answer at the end. Probably a cooking analogy is what I would use with my students. A time when I really screwed up a stew, but we could still eat it. It wasn't really great, but it was palatable. Whereas in long division, that's not the case. You make one mistake in long division and you end up with the incorrect answer. So I might tell a funny story about screwing up a meal and explaining how you can get away with that sometimes, but today you can't, right? Today we're making a meal that has to be perfect in every way. And then as I teach long division, I'm going to keep bringing the story back. When I get to the spot where we have to subtract from the remainder to get the next number that we're going to work from, I might say, so this is the moment when we're going to sort of pull out the bad potatoes, and we're going to only leave the good potatoes behind. So I'm always working the story back in so it doesn't feel isolated as two parts, but one complete whole. But I start with the story for entertainment purposes, really, to get people to enjoy what's happening, change brain chemistry in really significant ways by telling a story and hopefully making them laugh a little bit, and then continuing to lean into that story so it doesn't feel like something that I use simply to hook you, but something that was important to every step that I took along the way.
Wow. Wow. So the lesson becomes, sounds very purposeful. The lesson becomes an entire narrative around that division.
It does. I'm always asking myself sort of, what is the theme or meaning or message that I'm trying to deliver on this day? So if it was long division, the theme is precision. We have to be precise. And so I ask myself, what story do I have from my life where I was either extremely precise and it worked out, or even better, a time when I was not precise and it did not work out? And so I can combine those two things. And that allows me to speak on any topic. So when someone calls me and says, can you deliver a keynote for X conference? The answer is always yes. I don't even need to know what the topic is when I book it, because I know what I'm really asking myself is I'm not going to speak on that topic. I'm going to speak on a theme related to that topic, which makes it much more interesting. So when I had to do the closing keynote at a human trafficking conference a few years ago, when I arrived, the woman said to me, did you do some researching on human trafficking? I said, oh, no, I'm not going to talk about human trafficking. And she said, this is a human trafficking conference. And I said, I know, it's going to be fine. She wasn't happy with me, but I knew it was 5 minutes before I was going to speak. There was nothing she could do. But essentially, I got up and I told a story about how when you're in the human being business, for me, it was teaching, you can't afford to wait. I told a story about failing a student because I just assumed I wasn't going to be able to make a change in her life. So I sort of gave up and decided they'll probably fix her next year because I can't seem to fix her this year. But when you're in the human being business, you can't give up. You have to be relentless at all times. And then I was able to tell the people in the conference, as people who are fighting human trafficking, you are also in the human being business. When someone says it takes a long time to steer a big ship in a new direction, you have to say the hell with that. no, there's people on this boat and it's heading towards an iceberg. You have to steer it quickly. And they loved the speech because it wasn't about human trafficking. They had heard plenty all weekend about human trafficking. What they wanted was a speech related to what they were doing, but not necessarily matching the content. And I think that when we take content that is separate from the message we're actually trying to deliver and merge them, I think the merging moment when that happens is magic for people. I think that's sort of when their minds open and expand and they see things and new ideas. So that's what I'm always trying to do when I'm telling a story that is matched to a lesson or an idea that I'm trying to share.
Wow. So for the keynote example that you just brought up, how did you decide on the theme?
Well, I asked myself, if I'm in the human trafficking business, meaning trying to end human trafficking, I asked myself, what are some of the important things related to that, related to that problem? And I realized urgency is an issue. I know that if someone is literally being human trafficked at that moment, if they're being forced into that unfortunate and terrible world, you have to be relentless and you have to be quick. And so I asked myself, what story do I have where either I was relentless and persistent, or even better, a time when I failed to be relentless and persistent? And that was the story I found and said, oh, I'll tell that story. So I just sort of asked myself, what is a theme, meaning, or message that will apply here? And ideally, what's one of the best theme, meaning, or messages that apply here? And that's the one that I'll go with.
Yeah. One of the other things that I learned from you, which really made me just, again, totally shifted my mindset about stories that I choose to tell, is don't tell stories about your successes. No one wants to hear about your successes. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the problem with talking about your successes is it requires no vulnerability. It's easy to say nice things about yourself, which is why no one really wants to hear them. We walk through this world so often assuming that we are the one who is failing at this or not meeting the standard at that. And the problem is because when we open our phones, we look at idealized versions of everyone's lives. Every picture is glossed over and photoshopped so everyone looks their best. We're never taking photos of our failed meals. We're only taking photos of our most beautiful meals. We're not taking photos of the time we split our pants. We're taking photos of our best looking outfits. And so we walk through this life feeling like we are the failure surrounded by success, when that's absolutely not true. And so if you're someone who is willing to say, I am a fairly flawed human being who fails every day, and let me tell you about all the stupid, inconsiderate, embarrassing, and shameful things that I've done, it affords people the opportunity to feel better about themselves, to feel better about their humanity, to feel more connected to you. It's really hard to connect to someone who tells you that they hit 3 doubles and scored 2 runs in the baseball game. But tell me that you struck out to end the season. I can connect with that right away because I understand what it's like to fail other people. But to be the hero, to be the winner, in every competition, there is only one winner. I'm telling my students this all the time. In every competition you enter, you are almost certainly going to be the loser, because almost everyone in every competition ends up being the loser except for the one who wins. We don't want to hear from the winner. We want to hear from the losers because that's who we tend to be. And that's what we need to feel better about. So I am always looking to talk about my failures whenever I can.
Yeah. Do you think that vulnerability is becoming a bit cliched? Because as soon as people have realized its power in the past decade or so, with Brene Brown and a lot of other speakers, do you think it's ever going to go out? Is it going to, is it timeless? Is there something that about vulnerability that will always stick around?
It'll always stick around. It's like gold. It's like asking if gold is going to stop being precious at some point. There is something about vulnerability that people are drawn to because vulnerability requires courage, and people are drawn to courage. So you're drawn to the firefighter who races into the building to rescue the baby on the 3rd floor. That is real courage. But there's also a great deal of courage required to stand in front of 2,000 people and talk about your most shameful parenting mistake ever made. And people are drawn to that courage. They understand that it's not an easy thing to do. We watch sports because the sports on television that we watch are not easy to play. We know because we've tried most of them and we understand how difficult it is. So to watch someone do something that is not easy is very appealing. And so to watch someone stand on a stage and say, here is how I'm flawed is not an easy thing for a person to do. And that's why we tend to admire it and we tend to be drawn to it. And in the end, it just makes people feel closer to us. I am the bearer of more secrets than you could possibly imagine. Some of them really uncomfortable things that people have told me, and some more benign. But it's always because I stand on a stage, I share something vulnerable of myself. And the moment I step off the stage, invariably someone comes up to me and speaks to me about things you can't begin to imagine. And so often they tell me I'm the first person they've decided to tell. And it's only because I stood on a stage and did something that most people are unwilling to do, but perfectly capable of doing if they sort of toughen up a little and find a little courage and take the microphone.
Yeah. What's the line between vulnerability, oversharing? Where do you draw the line?
Well, there's a saying in storytelling, we say we tell our stories from our scars, not our wounds. So if you are sharing a story as a means of therapy, or you have not processed a moment sufficiently enough, then it is a terrible moment for an audience because you're essentially hijacking that audience for your own purposes. So that is sort of a fail. If you can talk about a moment of great difficulty from your past, but you can speak about it with craft and with skill and even with humor, that is a sign to the audience that I have experienced something terrible and I am now past it. And now I can share the wisdom of that moment with you. So a lot of it comes down to, are you really in a place that you can speak about that thing? And at that point, you can almost speak about anything. You know, I tell people the two areas that I tell storytellers to avoid at all times is if you've ever harmed an animal, nobody wants to hear about it. And if you've ever hit a woman, nobody wants to hear about it. But other than those two realms, which I would tell people to avoid most of the time, if not all the time, I think you can probably share about almost anything. I was at a Moth StorySLAM a few years ago in New York, and a woman took the stage. It was unbelievable. She took the stage and she began telling the story about her abusive husband and how he was threatening to harm their child. And she had the man murdered to protect her child. The room went silent when she said it. And she said it essentially to the effect of, and so I killed him. And we sort of didn't believe her at first, but we were all stunned in silence. And we immediately went to our phones and looked it up. And we found out it was true. The Innocence Project had actually gotten her released. She had hired someone to kill her husband because he had threatened the life of her child. And she had spent 22 years in prison and had just been released and decided to come to the Moth and tell the story. And that was the kind of story that I would think, I don't know if you can tell that story and be received well by an audience. And yet she did, because she had had 22 years locked up to think about how she was going to tell that story. And that night, it came out incredible. She won the slam, but was not there to receive the certificate because she had to get back to her halfway house because she was on parole and she had to be home by 10. But even that story, she managed to tell with great skill and craft in a way that the audience appreciated what she told, even though it was a story about having another person killed in order to protect your child. So I think the line is pretty far away most of the time.
Yeah. Do you ask permission of your subjects to talk about them in your stories?
It depends. So if I'm telling a story about a student, I wait at least a couple years and I always change their name. And a lot of times I'll also sort of scrub identifying characteristics to protect their anonymity. If it's a friend and I think they will come across poorly in the story, I will always ask them before I tell it. Same thing goes for my wife. I told my children that before the age of 10, I had the right to tell any story about them whatsoever because I was keeping them alive. I said, at the age of 10, you kind of could keep yourself alive. So now I have to ask your permission. But anything before 10 was fair game. And my kids are kind of okay with that. You know, I also think that permission doesn't always need to be asked. I tell stories about my stepfather, who was a terrible person and remains probably a terrible person this day. I don't ask his permission. Anne Lamott famously said, if you wanted me to speak nicely of you, you should have treated me better in the first place. And so I apply that rule as well. What I tell people is you should never tell a story that might damage a relationship that you honor and trust and believe in and need. So if you have a story about your mom that might hurt her feelings, you should not tell that story. Go find a different story to tell. So, it's a case by case basis, depending on who they are and what their situation is.
Yeah. Wow. What a, I'm still processing that. That's amazing. Tell me the difference between an anecdote and a story, because this is something that, everybody has anecdotes. Everybody can collect anecdotes, but they're often not weighty enough. They don't have enough substance to carry whatever purpose you want to use them for. But sometimes they have a use because they're like, let's say maybe for in your division class, that was an anecdote. That wasn't a story about being imprecise with your cooking. So tell me where is a good use for an anecdote? Where's a good use for a story? What defines the two?
So a story is about change over time, right? Transformation or realization, one or the other. I used to be one kind of person. Some stuff happened. Now I'm a new kind of person. That's a story. That cooking story could be a story. I could tell a story about how I hoped to make a beautiful meal for my fiance at the time. It was going to be the first stew I ever cooked, and I was ready for it. And then some stuff happened, and I discovered that cooking is a lot more difficult than I ever imagined. And I actually wasn't giving her credit where it was deserved. I had assumed she just opened a book, followed the directions, and produced great food. I could do the same. I learned over time that this is a art as well as a craft, and it's going to take effort. So that would be the story version of it. That's a real story I could tell. An anecdote doesn't have change over time. An anecdote is essentially this thing happened and it's notable and worth mentioning. But after I tell it to you, you're probably not going to remember it in 3 days because there's no real heart to it. So, like, an anecdote is my son is very fond of proposing to my wife, Mom, will you marry me? And she says to him all the time, I already married your father. I can't marry you, which always bothers me because the answer should just be no. But she's always qualifying it. So a few days ago, he proposes to her again, Mom, will you marry me? And she says, I already married your father. I can't marry you. And he looks over to me and he points his fingers at me like a gun and says, pew, pew, right? Which is essentially patricide. He's proposing he's going to kill his father so he can marry his mother, right? That's not a story, but it's an amusing anecdote. I keep those in my pocket all the time. Whenever I go to any event whatsoever, I have 5 anecdotes always in my pocket. I use them to grab the audience if I feel like I'm losing them. I use them to make the audience laugh if I feel like we need to break some tension in some way. So they're useful, but we have to understand they're not going to move an audience. They're not going to change anyone's mind about the world or themselves or the people around them, right? That's what stories do. That's what movies and books and real stories can do for us. Anecdotes are sort of, they're confectionery. They're lovely in the moment. And then sort of they often, disappear and don't really have a lot of punch behind them. But you're right. They have great use and I use them quite a bit.
Yeah. Tell me about stories within stand-up comedy, for example, because they're much more elaborate, I would say maybe precise with the language. How do you define a stand-up comedy story versus like a spoken word story that you would do at a competition?
Sure. Well, I do stand up as well. And essentially the difference between the two is a story that I would tell on stage at a storytelling show or a talk or anything like that. I will only deploy humor strategically. So where I think humor is necessary in a story, because I want people to laugh in the beginning to change brain chemistry. I want them to laugh before I make them cry because it makes it hurt more. I make them laugh during the boring parts to make them not feel so boring. So I'm only deploying that humor in a way that helps the story. If I take that same story to the stand-up stage, I'm going to load in every joke I possibly can get into it. My goal is to get them to laugh more. It's not my favorite version of the story, though, because I think a story is supposed to take you on an emotional journey. And the funnier we make a story, the more flat the story becomes. I think it loses a little bit of its punchiness, of its ups and downs, right? So in stand-up, the expectation, though, is that you're going to laugh more often. So I have to make you laugh more often. And that's really the only difference. And depending on the comedian you're looking at, if you're watching someone like Mike Birbiglia, he's leaning into story more than humor a lot of the time, which is sort of my method. I prefer to lean to story, but I'm definitely using humor a lot. Whereas someone else like a John Mulaney, he is definitely leaning more into jokes than the story. They're both doing the same job. One is just prizing the laugh more than the other. And the balance between the two is essentially where you land in terms of storytelling versus stand-up comedy.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a specific John Mulaney story where he talked about um, it was like a detective that came to his school when he was a kid. I don't know if you remember that story.
I
Uh,
do.
and the character was just so elaborate, and it was like a mini movie. I think it went on, must have gone on for about 8 or 9 minutes at least. I'm thinking also of maybe Eddie Murphy, the story that he tells about the family barbecue, if you remember that
Yes.
story.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there, that clocked in at about 12 minutes. There's so many different characters in the story. And obviously the goal is humor, but it was like a mini movie. I mean, you almost forgot where you were for 12 minutes.
That's the goal of a storyteller. Is I always say I want you to forget where you are and who you are. I want you to feel like suddenly you're in my world, you're living on my planet.
There's a secret that great public speakers know. Did you know there's a method for cutting straight through to an audience's heart, grabbing their attention and holding it, and making a memorable impact with your presentation? The best speakers in the world utilize it, and now you can too, every time you get up to speak. Download your free Maggid Method of Public Speaking template at maggidmethod.com, maggidmethod.com. The Maggid Method will teach you how to find your authentic voice, craft meaningful presentations, manage people's attention, and build unbreakable bonds with your audience. Go to maggidmethod.com and download your free copy now. Now let's get back to the program.
I do think that one of the things that separates most stand-up comics, but not all, from a storyteller, at least a storyteller like me, is stand-up comedians are more than happy to invent things to raise the level of humor in a stand-up show. I know someone like a Mike Birbiglia does not do that. I know he adheres to the truth, and I do too. I have no objection to taking something out of a story that doesn't serve me or distracts in some way, but I've never added anything to a story or to any of my stand-up bits that didn't actually happen. So when I hear Eddie Murphy telling the barbecue story, I know in my heart that it's like 60% true and 40% invented. And I'm not a fan of that. I mean, I'm a fan of the comedy and I'm a fan of the craft and I like laughing. It all works out great. But in the end, I think the best version of all of those bits are the true versions where you fight like hell for the laugh rather than inventing things to produce a laugh. That's the approach that I prefer to take.
Yeah, got it. Okay, let me ask you a couple questions about, let's say, clergy for specifically. Some of the common pitfalls that you find or blind spots you find that when someone's giving a sermon or a speech in a life cycle event or just on a regular Sunday or in my persuasion on a Saturday. What are some of the things to look out for?
Well, I know the text is important. It obviously is sort of the bedrock of all that you do, whether it's the Bible or the Torah or whatever. But I think that quite often when I'm in a sermon, when I'm watching a sermon or anything like that, opening with the text, I think is oftentimes a disaster. Essentially you're saying, all right, we're going to open up this ancient book now. And we're going to cherry pick, by the way. We're not going to mention some of those stories that never get mentioned at church. We're going to cherry pick a story and I'm going to read an old book to you. And we're going to start with that. I sort of think if you're looking to lose your audience, that's a great way to do it. It'll essentially be like arriving at NASA and having them say, all right, before we look at the spaceship, let's take out the engineering specifications and let's look at the blueprints for a while before we go out and look at the space shuttle, right? It's really a way to sort of kill the mood. I'm not opposed to including the text. I'm just opposed to sort of like leveraging the text in such a meaningful way. I kind of think that the story and the wisdom and the lesson should be forefront, and it should be the text that sort of supports what is being said. So here is my story and here's the wisdom. And by the way, Jesus agrees with me. Take a look at this. He spoke the same thing and he probably said it better than me. But when we lead with it, we're essentially leading with something that's old and probably has been read before, and most people assume is not going to be very great. I've read the Bible cover to cover 3 times, and I never laughed while reading the Bible, right? And I never felt super entertained. I read it and I consumed it, and I know a lot about it now as a result, hoping to find faith. Honestly, that's the reason I was reading it. But I know it's not entertaining. It's instructive, it's illuminating, it's enlightening, it's even inspirational at times, but it's not entertaining. So if you open with it, you have to know you've now opened with the least entertaining part of your sermon. And I think that belongs later on in the sermon. So I think that's a pitfall that I see quite often. Yeah. I also just think that so often clergy members remain black boxes to their congregations. I worked with 12 rabbis at a retreat one time. They were all sent to me because their congregations had deemed them kind of boring. And they knew that coming in. So they were not happy about meeting with me to begin with. It wasn't an ideal situation. I won them over with whiskey at a bonfire one night, and we started telling funeral stories, and everybody sort of opened up. But, the interesting thing about them was they didn't think it was very important that their congregations knew about them. They felt that they were sort of transfer devices of wisdom from text to congregation. And that essentially just leaves them standing in a middle ground as a mystery. And I think that's a mistake. It's the same thing that teachers do when they remain as black boxes to their students. Like I had teachers that I didn't know if they were married or had kids. And I think that's crazy. Like some of the teachers I had as a kid, I couldn't tell you anything about their private lives in any way whatsoever. And those were the least effective teachers for me because I never felt connected to them. My best teachers were the ones who I knew something about their life, even if it was that they loved their dog, or they had a swimming pool in the backyard that they couldn't wait to open in the summer. These little things really mean things to people. So I just don't think you should remain a mystery to your congregation in any way whatsoever.
Yeah. How do you rehearse stories? Do you memorize stories? Do they evolve over time and until they're where they are now?
I don't memorize. I use the word I remember them, meaning if I were to tell you a story now that I've told before, and then I told it to you immediately again, they would come out differently. The scenes would be in the same order. The events would happen in the same order. The dialogue would stay the same, but the sentences I choose to convey the story would be slightly different each time. I don't like to memorize stories. I've never memorized anything I've ever spoken on stage, honestly, because when we memorize, we create chains of words and sentences. And if we drop a word or a sentence, the chain breaks. And that's when we get lost. So I prefer to remember them in terms of scenes. I remember, okay, first I have to talk about this. And if I have a great laugh line or a great transition, I'll try to memorize it. But if I fail to deliver it, it's okay because I'm still telling the story. What I do is I make a recording of the story, a good recording when I'm happy with it. And then I just start listening to it. I pop my headphones on my head when I'm grocery shopping, folding laundry, riding the bike. I listen to myself tell stories about myself to myself, which is the most narcissistic thing you can possibly do. But it allows the story to sort of sink into my bones so that if someone hears me tell a story 5 years ago, and then they call me and say, can you come to our event and tell that story you told 5 years ago? I can listen to it once and already have it sort of right back in my mind, ready to tell again. So I do that most of the time. And sometimes I sort of make up stories on the spot if necessary. But I don't like to over prepare in any way whatsoever. The stories will evolve over time occasionally, in that I will remember things that I did not remember the first time I crafted the story. I've gotten on the stage and told a story, and while I was telling it, I realized something else happened that made for a better ending. And so I changed the story on stage as I was telling it. One time my wife accused me of holding back to surprise her. I sat down and she said, you held that ending back? And I went, no, I thought of it on stage and wove it in. So I afford myself the opportunity to sort of remember better or to condense better, to tell it in a better way, but they tend to be pretty locked in once I've sort of put it together.
Yeah. Do you get nervous before you get on stage?
I don't. I'm a monster, though. I'm the only person I know who doesn't get nervous. And I have performed with actual famous people, people who have been on television in front of millions of people, and they are nervous before they take the stage. The combination of hubris and disregard and stupidity, it weaves a blanket around me that prevents me from ever being nervous on stage in any way whatsoever. So no, I've never been nervous, but everyone else is, and there's nothing wrong with it.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like you don't take yourself too seriously. Is that the secret?
My wife says, and she's probably right, that I genuinely don't care what most people think of me, which is a double-edged sword, she will tell you. She said it is a superpower for sure, because I move through life, and if I think my decision was right and just, I kind of don't care what anyone else thinks about it, with probably the exception of her. She's the one person who can sort of like, levy the sword of Damocles on me. But on the other end, by not caring what other people think, I sometimes really run into some difficult situations where I say things that I should not have said, particularly to people who have more power than I do and have power to create problems in my life in ways I don't need. So that sometimes causes a problem too. But what honestly happened was, when I was 21, a gun was put to my head and I was told that I was going to die. And then the trigger was pulled. And it's the most difficult thing that ever happened in my life. But in that moment, almost nothing else since that moment seems to matter very much to me. Like all the problems of my life now seem minuscule compared to a moment when someone puts a gun to your head and begins counting back from 3. And so every time I'm facing a problem that seems sort of terrible or overwhelming, I always think, well, it's really nothing. I mean, I'm going to get past this and we'll move on and life will be fine. And again, that's a double-edged sword. My wife loves it some of the time, but some of the time she says to me, like, it's okay to be worried about this right now. And I'll say, I know, kind of. I'm like, but in 2 weeks, we won't even care about this anymore. So why don't we just pretend it's 2 weeks from now and be done with this? So I'm a difficult person to live with some of the time, but I'm very convenient at times as well.
It reminds me of was that movie with Jeff Bridges, Fearless, where he had a near-death experience and then he wasn't afraid anymore. He used to walk on 200-foot high walls, and he just didn't care.
I don't know that movie, but that's
Yeah.
essentially true for me. Now, I wouldn't be doing that. I don't put myself in life-threatening situations, but it is true that in a great deal of my life, I don't care. We get as a teacher, I'm often asked to give feedback on our professional development sessions, and it's always anonymous. You're allowed to present anonymous feedback, which is terrible, by the way, because that indicates that there's a lack of psychological safety in an organization when the feedback has to be presented anonymously. But I sign my name all the time, even though they wanted anonymous. And my superintendent called me last year and said, I just want you to know, we never receive scathing feedback as scathing as the feedback you provide, but you always sign your name to it. So I respect that. But honestly, it's because I don't care, because I'm not afraid, because I'm only speaking the truth. And as long as I'm speaking the truth, I know nothing bad will come of me other than perhaps I won't get to climb that unfortunate administrative ladder, which I'm not looking to climb anyway.
Yeah. So let me ask you some contemporary questions in regards to storytelling. Attention spans. Are you finding that you have to navigate the short attention spans, phones, digital diversions, things like that?
Nope, not if you're good, right? No, if you're good, time doesn't matter. You can hold an audience for 90 minutes if you're good. I think that attention spans become a problem when you're not good. I think that most people, maybe almost all the people who speak publicly, weirdly assume attention. I tell people that no one wants to hear anything you ever have to say unless you give them a reason to listen. And that belief is in the marrow of my bones. And so even now, I am assuming that no one listening to this podcast wants to hear anything I have to say. And so I am relentless in my attempt to maintain attention at all times. And I think if you adopt that philosophy and then you find strategies that will allow you to do that, attention span becomes irrelevant. and I teach 10-year-olds for 7 hours a day. I could easily lose their attention, and I don't, because I am relentless in my attempts to hold their attention at all times. So no, I don't think attention spans have gotten any shorter. I think public speakers have gotten lazier. I think content has become more diluted over time, but no, I don't have any problem with attention span. You just got to be good.
Yeah, and phones.
Well, if they have a phone in their hand, that might be a problem. But, I was at a conference, a professional business conference, just a couple of weeks ago speaking. And when I took the stage, I said, all right, so first of all, I'm going to be speaking for the next 45 minutes. And if you pick up your phone, I'm going to call you out. So don't pick up your phone, or you will be isolated as the person who couldn't keep their phone down for 45 minutes. And I don't want to hear about babysitting, and I don't want to hear about house fires. Back in 1983, all of these things were irrelevant to us. We managed to sit in a room for 45 minutes without getting on a phone. Let's try to do that right now. And nobody touched their phone, right? And that was actually entertaining and different and aggressive and amusing. And it did a whole bunch of things to that room that told them that the person standing in front of you is different than all the other people you have seen today, and probably different than all the people you've seen this year. He's going to come after you if you pick up your phone, right? And that's why attention span is not a problem for me. Because if they had picked up their phone, I would have called them out, and I would have said, tell us what you're doing on your phone right now. And that would have been wildly entertaining to the room as well. So no, you can take care of phones. You can eliminate them and eliminate their problem. It's very easy.
That's great. I got to use that. I want to ask you about starting in the middle of the story, because it makes so much sense in, let's say, a movie or a TV show, where I don't know if I heard this example from you, but you think of like a James Bond movie, right? Or a Mission Impossible, where you land in the middle of this crazy conflict, adventure, tension, and it goes on for about 10 minutes, and then the credits roll, and then, which is amazing. It sucks you right in. I think it was Quentin Tarantino once, he said, when a movie starts, I want to throw a stick of dynamite in the lap of the audience as quick as possible, which is fantastic. For some reason, not when you do it, but when I see other people do it, it seems a little bit contrived. When you would just open up in the middle of a story, it's I don't know exactly how to describe it. Maybe self-referential, or it just seems a little bit too contrived. Most people don't begin stories that way. It seems too staged or rehearsed. Or so maybe if you could speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, there's a couple problems probably going on. The stick of dynamite is a great quote, and I support it, except I'm not a fan of saying stick of dynamite because it implies it has to be something huge. All you need to do is to land a question in the mind of the audience that they want answered initially, and then they want to hear the next sentence. And as long as you maintain that idea that there's always something they're wondering about as the story moves forward, it's essentially landing a stick of dynamite in their lap every single time. So, if I say at the beginning of a story, I'm trying to think of a story I've told recently, a story I tell about a spoon. I don't open the story with a little boy's hand emerges from a leaf pile holding a spoon. I say a little hand emerges from a leaf pile holding a metal object in his hand. And everyone automatically thinks knife or gun. I don't know why, but you say metal object, that's what they think. They also want to know if that's what it is. And so now I know I have them. I have them for 3 sentences until I reveal it's spoon. When I reveal it's spoon, I'd better land another question in their mind, and I do. Right. And that's another stick of dynamite, we'll call it, which causes them to want to know what's going to happen next. So I think the problem people run into when they open stories in the middle is they choose that like the car explosion to start with. For, they choose the stick of dynamite moment. They choose these huge moments as opposed to a more understandable, relatable moment that also affords them the opportunity to pose a question or to create some sense of wonder or mystery or suspense. It doesn't need much, just a little bit at the beginning of a story where the audience goes, huh, what's that? That's enough. We're prediction machines, human beings. We make predictions and then we want to see if they're going to come true. It's why gambling works, right? You never bet on the Jets game and then wait till Tuesday to find out if the Jets won, right? You bet on the Jets game and then you watch the game on Sunday to see if they won because you want to know when it happens. And storytelling in a lot of ways is the same thing. We want to create a situation where the audience is guessing or unable to guess but wants to know the answer to the next thing we're going to say. And so when we build our stories like that, then people want to follow us along. So if we just choose a place in the middle of the story that isn't wild, like at the beginning of a Mission Impossible story, which is naturally wild because we're in the middle of a spy thriller, I am not a spy. I'm just an ordinary guy, but I'm still going to choose a place, usually in the middle of a story or as close to the end as possible, that presents the opportunity for me to say something that creates wonder. And if you do it that way, it doesn't feel contrived anymore because it's a normal circumstance. You want people to feel like they're in a relatable scene where something is happening that causes them to go, huh, what does that mean? And then I'm off to the races.
Got it. I don't know if I heard this from you, but it sounds a little bit like sometimes when you're watching something through a lens and then the lens pulls back a little bit and then maybe 10 feet more and reveals a little bit more and reveals a little bit more. And then you can kind of understand what you're looking at. But until then, you're trying to make sense of it. And that keeps you engaged. Is that the...
Yes, I teach that a lot. I say that we're the cinematographers of our story, and the narrow lens is the storyteller's best friend, meaning it's often what we don't say in a story that is more valuable than what we do say. So if we think about telling stories, thinking of our eyes as the camera, and we narrow the lens in the beginning, and we only share a little bit of what we're seeing, and then we expand it a little bit more, and then a little bit more, over time, the audience starts to wonder what is next beyond the lens. I think what happens is people start stories by saying things like, I'm standing in the pharmacy and I'm waiting for my wife to come back from the medicine aisle. And that's sort of like very confusing because we don't know what to look at, right? But if I say, I'm staring at a bottle, it's a pink bottle on a shelf about eye height. It says Pepto-Bismol on the bottle. I don't actually need the Pepto-Bismol, but I'm staring at it because there's nothing else for me to do. There's nothing else for me to do because as I look down the aisle to the right, my wife has not returned. And as I look down the aisle to my left, my wife has not returned. I'm standing in the middle of an aisle in a pharmacy, wondering what the hell has happened to my wife. And the most entertaining thing I can find to do is to look at Pepto-Bismol. That actually oddly makes a nothing moment feel a little bit like something. And it's simply by using the lens of the camera and pointing it as a cinematographer would do at certain things, as opposed to like hovering above a scene and saying everything all at once.
Is that effortless for you at this point? That it sounds like if I have a scene to describe, immediately I just think of the narrative. I think about like you said, I'm standing in CVS looking at a pink bottle that says Pepto-Bismol. Do you have to calibrate and say, okay, well, how do I not reveal too much? Or is it just intuitive for you at this point?
It's pretty intuitive. I mean, I've been doing it for a very, very long time. What I do is when I tell stories, I really do view the story through the lens of the camera. And I tell stories beat by beat, which people often don't do. So I am looking to essentially reveal a second by second, or maybe not to that degree, because might be a little too painful, but a beat by beat example of what the story is, a beat by beat moment of the story. Most people sort of say everything all at once. They'll say, so I'm standing in a pharmacy looking for my wife, right? That's everything all at once. And I am thinking, no, that's not how it's told. Beat by beat is I'm standing in an aisle. I'm looking at a bottle. The bottle is this, right? I'm looking at it for this reason. And now I'm looking left. And now it just is the way that I see the story unfold in my mind. And it is the way that I choose to tell it to people. Now, that also means that I'm making lots and lots of choices with each beat. I'm deciding if a beat is relevant to a story as I'm telling it. And if it's not relevant, I'm dropping it away. And if it is relevant, I'm keeping it. And if it's really important, I'm elevating it. Or if it's the kind of beat that I need to say, but I don't want you to know is important because it's going to produce surprise later on, then I'm going to hide it. So I'm sort of like looking at each moment in the story and asking myself its relevance, its importance, its dependence upon the end of the story to play out all of those decisions I'm making on a second by second basis. It doesn't mean the first draft of every story is good, though. Quite often in the first draft of a story, I'll say something and go, oh, why did you say that? You just messed something up. And then I have to decide whether I can cover it up or I have to live with the mistake and just move on. So, while I'm making those choices, they're not always the correct choices the first time through.
Yeah. All right. I want to respect your time. I know you're busy, school teacher. In addition, I'm sure you have some tests to correct. But I just wanted to ask you one last question, which is you're touching upon this right now. How do you decide how much background to give to the story? What details to leave in, what details to leave out? Is that that's something I see people struggle with a lot because you get lost in the weeds.
Right. Well, in terms of background, you only say what is necessary for the story to stay intact, right? So if we need to know one thing about your mother in order for this story to work, tell us the one thing and nothing else. The problem is people love their mother, and therefore, in addition to the one fact we need in order for the story to play out, we also have to hear about their delicious beef stew on Sundays, and how they have a cat named Petunia who they love dearly. Like, we just want to share of our lives, which is great if you're speaking to a loved one who is legally required to sit next to you and listen to your reporting of your life. But audiences want to hear a story. And so we only put the things in the story that are relevant to the story. That also means that adjectives should be avoided at all costs. No one wants an adjective. No one hears a story and thinks, boy, I wish he had described more. Boy, I wish I knew what the color of everyone's hair was in that story, right? None of that is relevant. So what I tell people is, rather than relying on describing things, we leverage the audience's imagination instead. So if I have a story taking place in my kitchen, I'm not going to describe my kitchen to you. Instead, I'm going to tell you I'm standing in a kitchen, and I'm going to allow you to superimpose a kitchen for me. It's probably going to be your kitchen or your parents' kitchen or a kitchen you see on television every week. It doesn't matter to me. What you're going to do is choose the kitchen that you can see most clearly. And as long as the particularities of my kitchen are irrelevant to the story, I don't need to be in my kitchen. I just need to be in a kitchen. And I want you to choose yours because then I don't have to describe anything. If I have to mention that the floor is made of linoleum for the purpose of the story, I'll add that in and trust that you can shift your floor to linoleum if necessary. But I'm never going to describe anything. Instead, I'm going to choose good, hard nouns, pull them from your brain, and use them in my story. And so I will only describe things when their description is exceedingly relevant to the story. Otherwise, I avoid all of those things completely. That is not the same in the novels I write, of course. In a novel, people expect a fully realized world with lots of adjectives, and I'm more than happy to put them in there. But that's a book that's people are committing 8 to 20 hours to read. In a story, we're probably telling a story somewhere between 2 and 20 minutes, and they really don't care about Kelly's green eyes or, John's muscular back, unless the green eyes and the muscular back are relevant to the story. Otherwise, I'm just going to say Kelly, because you know who Kelly is. Like, if I say Kelly is standing next to me, you actually picture someone. You picture your idealized version of Kelly. I might give her an age so that you can land the right version of your Kelly. I might say Kelly's a 20-something, and now you've put a 20-something Kelly in your picture in my story for me. And as long as it doesn't matter what she looks like, I want you to pick her for me. So when it comes to details, avoid them at all costs. When it comes to backstory, only put in what is relevant to the story. That's what your audience wants. The mistake storytellers make is they often put in what they want rather than thinking what the audience actually would like from the story, not what you want to say. You say all the things you want to say to the people who love you and are willing to put up with you.
Yeah. It sounds like it's the difference between storytelling and journalism. You don't need to relate all the facts. It's just not
right. Yeah, you really don't need all of the facts at all. You only need the relevant facts. And I run into people all the time who say, "Oh, but I just want everyone to see the white dress that my mom was wearing." I say, "I know you do. So go and tell your husband and go tell your mother and go tell your aunt. But when you tell me that the dress is white, but it's not relevant to the story, what you're essentially telling an audience is, I'm going to steal a little bit of your bandwidth to tell you the dress is white, which means you need to remember that it's white throughout the rest of the story. And when the audience discovers that the white dress had no relevance to the story, they're probably going to be annoyed at the end because they're going to wonder, why did she have me thinking about the white dress the whole time when it didn't matter what color the dress was, right? It
Yeah.
only mattered to the storyteller, not to the audience. And that's the question we ask ourselves all the time.
Amazing. Okay, very last question. Your thoughts on AI?
Oh, I love AI. I love AI. I love AI because it's flattening language, which means people who know how to tell stories will stand far above everyone else. Large language models essentially take everything that someone has said before, makes it generic, finds the most common usages of those, and produces content. It doesn't produce originality. It doesn't produce vulnerability. It doesn't produce new things. It produces recycled versions of old things. So great storytellers are going to stand above everyone else because so many people are now utilizing and relying on AI to do their writing for them. And their writing sounds like an AI wrote for them, which is grammatically correct and nuanced and filled with the buzzwords and not special. And so I love it for that reason, because I know that great storytellers are going to shine even brighter than they did before. That said, I love AI for its uses too. If I need to come up with a list of 30 ways that you can use a lemon, I used to come up with that list on my own. Now I ask AI to generate the list for me. I look at the list, and then if I'm sparked by the list to add some more of my own items to it, I will. But it helps me brainstorm and generate ideas. It writes a lot of my email that are irrelevant emails. Write me a business email that says this, it does it for me. That's beautiful. All of those meaningless tasks or those benign tasks that we used to do that are being taken away, that's great. But true creativity, AI doesn't produce that. So storytellers who know what they're doing are going to shine.
Amazing. Okay, can you tell us where we can learn all about everything that you do?
Oh, sure. If you go to matthewdix.com or storyworthy.com, both of those places will sort of lead you to storytelling and lots of the things I do, the resources I offer, things like that.
Okay. And StorySLAM, that's the new one, the newest one?
Yes, StorySLAM is the newest book. It's essentially Storyworthy was my first storytelling book, which came out in 2017, and that's a book on how to tell great stories. StorySLAM is the how to tell great stories in the business world. So it takes all of the practical and principles from Storyworthy and applies them to a more business or branding setting.
Got it. And you're available for speaking and coaching and all that?
Yeah, I do a lot of that. Yeah, it's surprising I managed to fit it in with my teaching schedule, but when you love doing something, you find ways to make it work.
Amazing. Wow, you are a true professional, and I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to shoot you all my questions. And I hope this is valuable for everybody who comes across it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. All right, I'll be back in touch. Thank you, Matt. Have a great night. Okay,
all right, thank you.
See you later. Hey there, fellow podcast listeners. I hope you're finding value in all the insightful conversations coming your way, and I'm grateful for all the time we get to spend together. Now, I have a small favor to ask, one that can make a big difference. Your feedback is invaluable to me. By taking a moment to rate and review this podcast, you're not only showing your support, but also helping it reach new heights. Picture this: more reviews means more visibility. More visibility means more incredible guests lining up to share their stories and expertise with you. So, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, how about making some magic happen? Scroll down, tap that rating, jot down a few words. It's that simple. Your action today can pave the way for even greater experiences tomorrow. Thanks for your support.